First of all, just passing on further my acknowledgement that I'm talking to you from Gadigal land, and extend my respects to elders past, present and future, and any First Nations people watching today. I'm here to talk to you about consumer choice and sustainability. I'm going to take you on a dance through about just 20 odd slides, pulled from a lot of research that we've done at Pollinate, talking to people across a whole range of different food choices, different industries, different sectors. And we've got the good fortune to work with meat and livestock, to work with dairy, to work with grains, to work with farmers in general, but also to work with consumers across the myriad of choices they make in supermarkets and the trade-offs that they find they're having to make all the time. What I want to share with you today is what I've distilled from this around how consumers are choosing and where sustainability fits into that choice architecture. And at the same time, really trying to help us to understand what's the role of sustainability in consumer choice, and how can we better help the consumer to include sustainability in their choices. So I've got a couple of headlines today that I'm going to take you through. The first one is this, which is that at point of purchase, when people are making choices what to have literally for dinner tonight, it's actually all about price on the one hand and freshness on the other. Our challenge really is to make it easy for people to make a good choice. And I know that sounds really straightforward, but I think the most common question asked in Australia at a recent survey with, I think, the ABC, which is the leading news and public news outlet in Australia, was the most asked question in Australia every day is, what's for dinner tonight? So that's what's going through the mind of the grocery buyer. And here's some data. This data is actually taken from some work we've done with the red meat sector, but I can assure it's exactly the same data that we found working for supermarkets and also working for other food retailers. And pretty much it's consistent every single time. The most important drivers of choice at point of sale, when people are choosing what to have for dinner or this over that in terms of food, are consistently freshness and price. And I should say at this point, freshness and price are really proxies. They're proxies for on the one hand, is it accessible? Is it affordable? Can I actually have this? On the other hand, it's is this good for me? Freshness is a proxy for natural and quality. And of course, what we see now is the juxtaposition of freshness and price is that quality and value paradigm. Will they eat it? Will they enjoy it if it's family? Is it good for me? Am I making trade-offs there? And can I afford it? So that's the two biggest drivers. If you look down this list, country where it's produced is a big thing in Australia. Food safety, animal welfare, is it well cared for? Hormones has been a thing, free range. But if you go down there, you'll see that sustainability is not on that list. The top two drivers are freshness and price. And these are effectively heuristics. They're mental shortcuts that the consumer is using in Australia. And likewise, by the way, so is grown in Australia. Grown in Australia is a heuristic for it's probably good then. And animals well cared for is a heuristic for it's probably natural, and there's a good ethics here. So price and health, the top two drivers consistently across all food buying research. I should say this is also the case when we look at things like fast food. It's also the case when we look at even food, which is discretionary food. It's still pretty much price and health. It's just that, as you can imagine, price and health and convenience often trump for certain categories. If you want to see how pervasive this is, in Australia, duopolies are a big thing for a whole host of reasons. History and geography. Australia is a vast continent, as well as infrastructure and logistics. A lot of Australian food retail and industry has kind of tended towards duopolies or very large group buying. Duopolies are a big thing in Australia, and supermarkets are no exception. About 70% of Australian food purchasing is done through just two retailers. One is Coles and one is Woolworths. Coles is one of the oldest brands in Australia, and it has advertising. This is their advertising that's called Down Down. And it's had this down, down advertising for over 10 years. In fact, that image you have on the screen is literally iconic. It's everywhere in Coles. They even flew in a British pop group to do a cover of their song with Down, Down as the lyrics. It's become an almost iconic, slightly famous, catchy jingle. Down, down, prices are down, and you see it everywhere. But effectively, Coles has positioned 100% of its food choices around, we give you the best price. We keep prices down, down for over 10 years. And the other side of the equation is a company called Woolworths. Woolworths has positioned itself as the fresh food people for over a decade. And unashamedly, everything in Woolworths is green, not red, is positioned in this lovely, what they call WAPL symbol. And everything they drive is about freshness. They have beautiful tiles behind a lot of their fresh food counters. Everything is always about freshness and effectively a heuristic that talks about health. They've been known as the fresh food people for over a decade. Coles has owned price or value for money for over a decade. And these two dominant powers haven't bothered with sustainability really at all until this year. And the reason for that is they didn't think the consumer cared. And it's only really this year in Australia that it's become a powerful force. Both of these companies are now unashamedly blizzarding the Australian consumer with advertising about being the most sustainable brand. But success we've found with food retailing and communicating to the consumer at point of sale comes from making it quick and easy to choose better. This is the Health Star rating. I'm sure many people, if not all of you, are familiar with the Health Star rating, the on-pack simple rating that simply gives more stars to good food and less stars to bad food. And that's really not even an ideal way to talk about it, but it's pretty much how the consumer sees it. They literally look at it and they go, more stars, good. And whatever we think about it, it makes it easy for the consumer to make a choice. You can argue that we've shifted the burden from manufacturers and retailers to consumers. We can say that it's empowering people to make better choices, but we can't argue with the results. It has been hugely successful. And it's been successful in one real point, which we found from the research, which is when a new product is on the shelf, the consumer tends to pick up the new product as an alternative to the one they were buying. And as a heuristic, a shortcut, if it's got more stars, they're much more likely to give it a go. And if they give it a go and it's as good as the old one, they tend to stick with it. So I'm not here to defend the Health Star rating, but I am here to say it's a really good demonstration that we can help the consumer to adopt new, let's call them healthy habits, if we make it easy. But again, the Health Star rating doesn't talk about sustainability at all. It's not at all part of the metric, and nor should it be. That's not what it was designed to do. But it is a demonstration, if we make it easy, the consumer will consider sustainability. So where is sustainability? Well, what we found when we dug more deeply into this research, we did focus groups, for instance, with consumers, looking at what they choose and how they choose. We've looked at sugar, for instance, and we've looked at juice, which has become almost a proxy for sugar, and a whole load of categories. And we tried to understand where was sustainability in this equation. And what we found was that consumer guilt, not sustainability, is the key issue. And I'm aligning consumer guilt here with a broader issue around food. Let me explain that a bit more. This is a simple, it took me about 2 minutes to find. These are just examples of currently what's been going on in Australia over a recent period in terms of, let's call them cascading health concerns. The Australian consumer has literally been bombarded with a fairly regular, scary story about something that they used to enjoy eating. It might be the product, it might be the production of that product, the process, the promotion of it. It's really all bad. They've got this meta frame of diet and obesity and health and well-being. They've got this underlying sustainability and animal welfare issues as well. But the big one is sustainability. And is it meat, or is it cured meat? Is it dairy? Is it organics? Is it sugar? Is it artificial sweeteners? Is it fat? Is it butter? Or is it margarine? Is it paleo or protein or convenience? Literally almost every part of consumer food choice has had some negativity around it, some sense that like, maybe that's not a good choice. Or as the consumer ends up thinking, it's just all bad. And literally in the focus groups, that's what they say. They just say, it's just all bad, so I've given up. Is any of it actually sustainable? They've got what one consumer termed as guilt fatigue. I'm just tired of feeling guilty about food and the food system and seemingly everything I eat. The way to think about this is that the consumer is exhausted by this burden they feel for making a good choice, a sustainable choice. They had enough of a challenge with like, will they eat it? Is it enjoyable? Is it good? Is it healthy? Can I afford it? And now we've given them this, yeah, but is it sustainable? Is what you're doing good for the planet? The consumer didn't ask for this responsibility for their food choices. They weren't asking to be burdened with having to choose a sustainable food over a less sustainable food. They just want to enjoy the joy of food. They want it to be easy to enjoy food. They want effectively to not feel guilty about their consumption. And again, everybody watching this is much more of an expert than me, but food has a cultural role. It's incredibly important in defining us and giving us meaning. It's a social norm. We bond over food across all cultures and societies. It's powerful as a socially cohesive force. Food has so many benefits. Feeling guilty about consumption cuts across all of these. And the consumer is, as I mentioned, fatigued by that. So where do we go? The first thing is we've got to recognize that what we say as people and what we do as people is different. We are conflicted. And that's what makes us delightful as people, as humans, is the fact that we're not logical, but we are irrational. And the data that we're finding now suggests that everything is starting to align. Freshness and price and affordability and those moral issues and ethical issues around sustainability are starting to line up. And the suggestion that we've got from the data is eventually it will start to shift. The consumer will reward people who give them affordable, healthy choices that are also demonstrating their sustainability credentials. At the core of this is consumers' relationship with food. And as we all know, it's ridden with internal conflict, with cognitive dissonance. I was looking for an image here, which I used to find, which had Diet Coke and chocolate cake. And interestingly, it's no longer easy to find on the internet. And there's much more thoughtful images like this. The point is that the consumer is kind of like, well, I love you, but are you good for me? And we have this huge amounts of things going on, this conflict. The consumer feels a need to walk away, but they don't want to walk away. They want permission to carry on enjoying the food that they like and that is good for them. So it's not about good food and bad food. It's about helping the consumers to resolve these internal conflicts, make healthier choices that are also more sustainable. And I just want to share some data with you, which really makes the point about how consumers resolve this conflict. And this is some data on being a vegetarian. Okay, so about 7–8% of Australians fairly consistently report that they are vegetarian. Okay, but what's really interesting is when we ask them, I do focus groups with them. We have large quantitative surveys. We've been doing it for nearly 20 years. About 58% at the moment of vegetarians also eat meat. And who am I to say they're not vegetarian when they tell me in a focus group, well, I'm vegetarian, but I also eat fish. I'm vegetarian, but I do eat chicken. I'm vegetarian, but I eat sometimes meat or occasionally or whatever. Okay. What about I'm vegetarian on Mondays, which is quite a common thing now, or I'm vegetarian most weekdays, or I'm vegetarian at home, but if I go out, I do love a steak. They're not wrong. They're entitled to think of themselves as vegetarian on certain days of the week and not vegetarian otherwise. And I'm not here to judge them. They're allowed to choose the food they want. Likewise, a lot of meat eaters have been vegetarian in the past. So we're seeing this sort of flexitarian approach, but it's important to recognize that people can reconcile their food choices by adopting different labels and finding peace with themselves for whatever reason they are conflicted. And that's absolutely fine. But what we're seeing here is it's not basically straightforward, okay? The important takeout from this is that we can't educate consumers out of guilt. Consumers are people. And they want to feel good about their food choices. The emotional drivers that we have, the need to connect, the cultural need we have to belong, the desire for joy from food and eating and sharing, these are incredibly powerful drivers, and they will always top any rational messages that we have. Most consumers, when we ask them, know how much is a correct portion to have. And most consumers, when we ask them, will say they do eat the correct portion. They don't eat too much. But most consumers, when we ask them, think that most other people don't. Most other people eat too much. We're quite capable of understanding something, knowing it to be true, and even thinking that we do it, but at the same time thinking that everybody else doesn't. And of course, the maths on that simply don't add up. And what we're finding is everyone is making more and more sustainable and ethical choices. These are examples, bio bags, and there's a brand called Who Gives a Crap toilet roll, which is kind of a playful, sustainable way on recycling. And when we ask people, they say things like, well, I guess I do buy more sustainable rubbish bags, and I do buy free-range eggs now. And that's a person who would have started off by saying, no, I don't really buy into sustainability. I don't feel guilty about what I buy. when we ask them what they've actually been buying, you'll find that they've been buying more and more sustainable choices. As I said here, I didn't think I did all that, but I do. People are making more sustainable and more ethical choices, and this is very much becoming mainstream now. The expectation that there will be a sustainable, better choice. So Australians do sustainability and ethical consumption. They do it by making choices. But the key thing I want to recognize here is there are currently very few choices to consume food sustainably. It's not easily labeled. The choices are often buried in language like free range. It certainly doesn't have a health star rating for sustainability. And the consumer is having to do all the hard work, which is why they're feeling so guilty or fatigued. What we're seeing, it's an incremental journey. Ethical choices are snowballing. There's more and more ethical choices that the consumer can make. There's more and more choices coming in. They're not yet fully in the mainstream, but we're seeing Coles and Woolworths, remember, this year, fully getting behind this. They're really pushing their production, their processors, their retailers, the brands to give them more sustainable choices. So we're seeing this really starting to emerge now, to snowball. And this is a great quote. This is actually from someone, I think, doing fast food research. And they said, the more ethical choices you make, the more you want to make, the more you notice others doing. So what we're seeing now is the ethical choices are snowballing. It's becoming more of a heuristic, more of a shorthand. And is it ethical? Oh, it's fair trade, or it's marine sustainable, whatever it might be. And this is possibly my favorite quote to share with you from a young man who's recently become a vegetarian. There are 100 reasons why you go vegetarian, and you only need one, and then the rest stack on top. And really, he's speaking the truth here, which is at some point we adopt some new habits, and then we choose sustainable food. And in this case, the gentleman was talking about actually just becoming vegetarian. But the point is, the system is beginning to become more joined up. And I think at the moment, for all of us in the world, we're dealing with what I call the COVID hangover. We're dealing with the fact that COVID really got in the way of a lot of momentum that was happening around changing the system. And the system people were looking at is meta. It's do our political system work? Do our institutions work for us anymore? Is it sustainable? Or perhaps maybe she won't be all right. And we're now dealing, as we come out of the other side of COVID, or at least cope with COVID, with, well, why are we propping up some industries? Why is there large amounts of economic stimulus around that? Is that actually a good thing to do? Sustainability and climate change are only seemingly getting bigger and more profound in their impacts. Have we been ignoring other problems as we deal with COVID? And the consumer is increasingly asking the question, where is sustainability with my food choices? I'd like to finish with this simple chart. I was given access to one particular food industry's global data, every single market, the US and Canada, Mexico and Brazil, the UK and every European market, Australia, New Zealand, China, Indonesia, Mexico, the Middle East. I literally had everybody's data sets. Did a whole load of data crunching with my team. And at the end of it, distressingly, all the data was completely different. So it would be nice if everybody collected consistent data, but that's a side issue because I'm a researcher. The real point was there was a consistent trend across every single data set. There was an alignment of freshness and price, accessibility and healthiness in almost every market. There was an alignment of ethical issues, principally sustainability, but also things like animal welfare. And those were starting to become aligned as well. All of the data showed that, yes, at point of sale, people didn't consider sustainability. That linear thinking, I have a goal, a task, what's for dinner tonight? Can I afford it? Will they eat it? Is it healthy enough? Sustainability is way down the list. It's fourth in line at best. When we ask people in total, when we look at why people have chosen to reduce or certain foods or to become vegetarian and the likes, it all aligned. Concerns about the environment were not fourth in line to people. They were the fourth facet of a complex interaction of aligned issues and values. And the consumer is starting to align sustainability with good, healthy choices, and they're expecting the industry and brands and producers to do the same. Thank you very much for listening to my charts and information. And I'd like to now hand you over to the next speaker, who is the excellent Mr. Brad Ridout.
Thank you very much, Howard, and good to be with everyone. First, let me share my screen. Okay, let's go. let me begin by saying that this is a really big and complex topic in sustainable diets. Not only have you got all of the complexity and involving evidence around health and diet quality, but you've got all the complexity and the many different dimensions that relate to the environment and the models that are changing and the evidence is changing. And so when you bring the two together, it becomes like a super duper complex problem to try and research. But we've fortunately been working on this for many years now, and the evidence base is starting to build up to a level where we can start to give some robust directions, and that's what I aim to share with you today. First point I'd like to make is that it's local solutions that we really need. A lot of research, if you scan the internet or you scan the scientific journals even, is coming from Europe, or it's coming from Sweden or India, China, Africa, US, wherever. But let's remember, our food system is not the same as everyone else's food system. We've got a vast continent, mainly pastures and rangelands with cropping systems too that tend to be more at the lower productivity end because we don't always have a lot of rainfall. So our food system is not the same as everyone else's food system, where our food comes from. The environmental challenges are not necessarily the same in Australia as they are elsewhere, and indeed they're not the same across Australia. Think of something like water scarcity. There are parts of Australia that experience water scarcity periodically, and there are other parts of the country that, well, water's just really abundant. Food cultures differ, public health and nutrition challenges differ, important sources of underconsumed nutrients differ, coming from the history of where our countries come from and so forth, and the people that have come to Australia. And in any case, the intervention opportunities are completely within a local food system, really. So we've been putting the emphasis into not so much understanding the international dimensions, but focusing on a good, strong Australian evidence base that we can help to inform you all. Now, the Australian approach we've been taking, it is involved environmental data for Australian food production and those commodities that we don't really produce much of in Australia, like tea and coffee and things like that, that are imported. But importantly, we include agriculture and food processing, and that's where life cycle assessment, which is basically just going through the whole supply chain, is important because a lot of impacts for some types of foods happen in the food processing part of the supply chain. And we do eat a lot of processed food in Australia, and it's important to include that aspect as well, particularly if you might have concerns about processed foods or ultra-processed foods. So it's important to capture it all. We use relevant environmental metrics. I already gave the example of water, so we don't talk about water use because water use really matters in some areas, and it's really a minor environmental issue in others. So we use water footprints, which take into account both how much water is being used, but where that water is being used and what the local level of water scarcity is. Those sorts of relevant environmental metrics, not just talking about resource use. Then we use a planetary boundary framework, which may be familiar to you if you've looked into the Eat Lancet diet, because they also use a planetary boundary framework. And where we're coming from there is that, yes, it takes water to produce food. We can't produce food out of nothing. So if we're using water and we want to reduce the water footprint or the pressures from water use in food production, we don't have to reduce it to zero. It's still okay to use water. We just don't want to use water at levels that are deemed unsustainable in local areas. So the planetary boundary framework helps us to understand that. It helps us understand, well, how much do we need to reduce our environmental impacts to be what might be considered sustainable? We also take a whole of diet approach. So it's not just about core foods, it's about all of the fizzy drinks and beer and wine and chocolate biscuits and potato chips and everything else, which is actually a big part of the Australian diet, unfortunately. And I'm sure that's a key area that you focus on in your own work and practices, because on the big public health nutrition challenge in Australia is we just eat far too many discretionary foods and not enough core foods. So we've got to consider those in our sustainable diet considerations and calculations as well. We use Australian Health Survey dietary intake data. I know it's a little bit old, but patterns of food consumption don't change that radically, even over several years. There are small trends that get highlighted in the media and so forth, but we compare over time, they're not so dramatic. But what's important there is we look at what Australians actually do. We don't sit in an ivory tower inventing diets that no one's ever going to eat and no one ever does eat, put certain things together that make mathematical sense. We look within the Australian evidence of what people eat, and we let the data speak to us to show us what are more sustainable dietary patterns in the Australian community, and how could we all be a bit more like those people that are already more sustainable in their habits. And we look at it through the lens of the Australian Dietary Guidelines, and if the Australian Dietary Guidelines change, we'll of course be able to revisit this and make adjustments accordingly. But the reality of diets in Australia, and I show you just one quick plot there where you've got diet quality on the x-axis and cropland demand on the y-axis. And each one of those points, there's 9,341 representing each of the adult daily diets obtained from the Australian Health Survey. And the first thing you should see there is that the range of diet quality and cropland scarcity footprint is just enormous in Australia. So anyone who's talking about the averages, well, what does the average mean? Because it is really so diverse. And the challenge is for us is that if we look at one environmental indicator and correlate it with another, we actually find that the different environmental indicators tend to have very weak correlations with each other. And that is the reason for that is not only the differences in the way people eat, but that individual foods score highly on some footprints and low on others. And then there's other foods that score low on some and high on the others. So you've got this tension, I guess you could say, in that there's no food that exists that has no impacts. Some are higher in some and others are higher in other different dimensions. And what we see here also in the graph is there's little or no correlation between diet quality and environmental footprint. I mean, we want diets to be both healthy and sustainable, but those two don't really go together. There are diets that are healthy, more healthy with high and low impacts, and diets that are less healthy with high and low impacts. And so just from the get-go, we know that this is telling us that it's going to be a real challenge to achieve multiple objectives concurrently. But this is what we've tried to do. We've taken 3 different environmental indicators, a climate footprint, a water scarcity footprint, and a cropland scarcity footprint, and they all link to planetary boundaries that are defined in the international literature. We've taken the dietary guidelines, we've applied the 3 footprints, we've joined them together into one combined environmental impact score, and I'll tell you in a moment just exactly how I did that, because that's a process in itself. But we looked for diets which had higher diet quality score and lower overall environmental impact, and I'll share with you what we found. Now, this is where we go into slightly more detail around the planetary boundary framework. You can see the climate footprint. The current value of Australian diets is 3.4 kilograms CO2 equivalents per person per day. Now, if we're going to cease to contribute to ongoing and additional climate change, that climate footprint has to reduce to 0. So it's a 100% reduction. On the other hand, a water scarcity footprint, the current water scarcity footprint of the average Australian adult diet is 433 litres per person per day. But according to planetary boundaries, it really needs to decrease to around 217 litres per person per day, which would be a 50.1% decrease. Cropland scarcity footprint, the planetary boundaries for the average Australian diet is 7.1 square metres of cropland occupation for a year per person per day to make the Australian diet. That needs to decrease to 5.6 because the planetary boundary experts suggest that cropland shouldn't cover more than 15% of the total ice-free land area. That will be a limit. I mean, there's kind of an expert opinion of what is a sustainable limit. That's to leave room for biodiversity and other land uses. And if you divide that area of land on the planet by the number of people on the planet and eating 365 days a year, you end up with this 5.6 square metres, which would be a 20.7% reduction. So we gave 58% weight to climate, 29% weight to water scarcity, and 12% weight to cropland. Now, there's a degree of subjectivity associated with that, but transparently, that's the model that we used. And you might personally weight the importance of those different environmental indicators differently, but that was what was done in the base case. But because there's a level of subjectivity, we created 3 alternative weighting models. Alternative 1 there, which has a bit more emphasis given to water scarcity footprint reduction. Alternative model 2, which gives almost all the emphasis to climate footprint reduction. And alternative 3, which is just giving equal weighting to each of them. I'm not going to say any more about the results from these alternative models because it's all there in the literature. There's a lot of data, but what you find is it doesn't change the outcome very much at all. The same conclusions are reached regardless of how much you tinker with these weightings given to the different environmental indicators within reasonable boundaries, of course. So this is what we find. You find this is the score, and it's just a score. It doesn't mean a lot in itself, the score. The average score for the Australian average diet is 0.43, but you can see how adults the scores are higher for men than for women, largely because they have higher dietary energy intake. And it also tends to be higher for the younger adults than for the older adults. Once again, because as people get older, they tend to eat a little less. And what we found in actual fact is that about half the variation in environmental impact score was explained by the total dietary energy intake. The other point to make is that about 29% or nearly a third of the environmental impact is coming from discretionary foods. And that's not because discretionary foods have all this terribly higher or bigger impact than other foods. It's just that we obtain about 30% of our dietary energy from discretionary foods. So of course, discretionary foods are a big part of our diets and a big proportion, in fact, the biggest proportion of our environmental impact comes from discretionary foods. They far outweigh the environmental impact that comes from fruits or from vegetables or from protein, meats and alternatives, or from dairy or grain foods, etc. It's discretionary foods that are the biggest impact. So we asked ourselves, here's the current diet, and as you can see there, we compared it to what if people ate the recommended numbers of servings of each of the different food groups. And we just scaled up or scaled down, in the case of discretionary food, the numbers of current servings to those that are recommended. So in the case of fruit, currently Australian adults, and this is just now in the 19 to 50 year age group, because the dietary recommendations differ by age, as you know. But in the 19 to 50 year age group, fruit consumption is currently 1.38 servings. So if we have to scale that up to 2 servings, so the environmental impact score would scale up, because we assume reasonably, I guess, if people ate the same types of fruits that they eat today, it's just that they ate a little bit more, 2 servings instead of 1.38 servings. And we did that for vegetables, breads, fresh meats. We assume that they eat the same proportions of fish, red meat, poultry, pork, vegetarian alternatives, nuts and eggs and so forth. Lo and behold, what happened? The total environmental impact actually increased by 6.6%. You gain a lot because the discretionary foods has to reduce from nearly 7.5 servings per day down to the 2.5 to 3. So you gain something that reduces the environmental impact score, but because all the core foods have got to scale up because we don't eat enough of any of the core foods, that actually leads us to overall a slightly higher total environmental impact. So just scaling up the way we currently eat doesn't do a lot. So then we said, okay, let's do a quadrant analysis. So we looked at a quadrant of the diets in Australia that have the highest diet quality score and the lowest environmental impact score. So these are the best quarter of diets in Australia, the highest diet quality and the lowest environmental impact. So what if people ate the recommended diet and ate the way these people do? Well, lo and behold, we reduce the total environmental impact by about 15%. So yes, it's possible to eat the recommended diet. And yes, it's possible to lower environmental impacts, but it's quite complex. It comes down to specific choices around fruits, specific choices around vegetables, specific choices about cereals. Actually, the improved diet had a not too different range of, still had a broad range of protein sources. Dairy foods are all coming out of the dairy system, of course, apart from the alternatives, doesn't vary much there. But yes, it is possible by shifting the diets within what is reasonable ranges of what is realistically done today and reduce environmental impacts. But the potential is modest, let me say that much. And importantly, no planetary boundary goals were met. So dietary change, you know, if you're going to achieve planetary boundary goals within Australia, I'm not sure it would even be possible, because it would be impossible in Australia to eat a diet that was climate neutral, because there's barely even a handful of foods in the Australian food system that are climate neutral. So work has to be done. No planetary boundary goals were met. It's difficult to achieve these multiple objectives simultaneously because they constrain each other to different goals. And we did identify trade-offs between environmental impacts. So we achieved 30% of the progress towards the climate goal, 28% of the progress towards the cropland goal, but actually the water footprint goal went in the opposite direction. And the harder we pushed on trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the bigger the footprint for water became. So that leaves us with two real strategies. I mean, yes, we can try and choose foods with lower environmental impact and achieve a little bit of gain, but there's a couple of big winners that we can work on: avoiding food waste and avoiding overconsumption. So why is there so many of these silver bullet, simple formulas that are out there in the media and elsewhere? I think it's because people just look at a single environmental aspect. Of course, if you're only going to reduce water scarcity, you can go a long way. You just avoid all those irrigated foods, fruits and vegetables, nuts and rice and so forth. If you're only going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you can go far by only worrying about those things and not worrying about the other environmental aspects. But once you bring the various environmental aspects together, it does become more complex. And for a whole range of other reasons, I would say beware people who think that there's a simple solution, a silver bullet, there's one thing that'll solve all the problems. So well, who needs to do the heavy lifting? Actually, the heavy lifting needs to be done on the food production side of the equation. And actually, there's tremendous potential through technology, through practice changes and so forth, to achieve incredible reductions in the environmental impacts of producing food. So just some case study evidence that I've been involved in, the water footprint of Victorian milk, we found, range from one farm to another, range from less than 1 litre per litre of milk produced to over 250 litres per litre of milk. So I'm not sure exactly what that is, a 300 or 350-fold different. Water footprint of fresh tomato being supplied into the Sydney market range from 5 to 50. That's a 10-fold difference. CSIRO's working on a special seaweed at the moment that, if you include it in the diet of livestock, reduce the greenhouse gas emission or the methane emissions by 80%. So the opportunities in food production are massive. And at the end of the day, as people who go out to shop for food, we can only buy what is there and available to buy. And so what we actually need is work in the food production side of the equation to make more sustainable food choices available. So in conclusion, I say the biggest things that we should be focusing on is avoiding food waste. Some estimates are that 30% of food people bring into their house gets wasted. And everyone will say, oh, shock, that's not me. But the evidence points that way. Promote consumption in line with Australian dietary guidelines and personal needs. I mean, it's not high tech or, sexy or whatever. But the reality is the environmental impacts of food consumption go up as dietary energy increases. And of course, some people are climbing scaffold and digging trenches and need to eat a lot. Many of us are working in desks and driving cars or whatever, riding trains, and we don't need to eat so much. So bringing our total food consumption down to what we actually need is actually a very effective way of reducing environmental impacts. And of course, maybe not for people in the nutrition community, but improved practices in technology and food production. It's the big one, because as I said before, we can only buy what's available to buy. We depend on the food production side of the equation to provide more low environmental impact food choices for us to buy. Thank you very much.